is ostracism. But the word ostracism comes from the Greek word for a potsherd, the ostrakon. So the custom was, as a kind of steam control, they would allow people who were upset with the government to go through and mark the name of one person on their ostrakon, on their potsherd. And then they would pile them up. And whoever had the biggest pile had to leave. They were exiled. It was plurality rule, didn't take a majority. And so this was the process that was going on in the square. And Aristides encountered, well, let's read. Aristides encountered an illiterate, clownish fellow. I've met some of those. Aristides being surprised, and so let me say one more thing. The illiterate, clownish fellow said, I can't write. Show me how to write Aristides on this. And he's asking Aristides. He doesn't know it. He's asking Aristides to say, please write Aristides on this for me. And of course, he can't read, so he can't tell what Aristides is going to write. There's a chance here for duplicity. But Aristides was surprised and said, asking if Aristides had ever done him any injury. None at all, said he, the illiterate clownish fellow. Neither know I the man, but I'm just tired of hearing him everywhere called the just. Aristides, hearing this, is said to have made no reply, but returned the shirt with his own name inscribed. And he won. He was actually ostracized, because so many people were so tired of hearing him called the just, rather than giving the people what they wanted, just or unjust, that he was ostracized from the city. On his departure from the city, lifting his hands to heaven, he made a prayer. The reverse, it would seem, of that of Achilles, that the Athenians might never have any occasion which should constrain them to remember Aristides. So if you say democracy, 1776, 1787, 1789, that's a really radical position that most people are going to say, I'm not so sure. Well, let's see a little bit about why. Question to start out with is, do we believe that there is a single right thing to do? That is there something that government should do? And if there is it plausibly discovered by asking people to vote? So the two central questions of government is there a right thing to do, or is there just a bunch of stuff we should try to keep government from doing? And then second, if there is a right thing to do, can we use voting procedures to try to discover it? It's the nature of collective choice then that they're unitary. There's one defense budget, one standard for pollution, and so on. Asking then what will we do begs the question in the philosophical sense. Question begging is assuming that which should be proved. Doesn't suggest another question, which is the way it's always used now, which makes me want to throw a book. Begging the question means assuming that which is to be proved. The real question is, why do you think there's a we? If we start out with, what are we going to do? Your answer should always be, why do you think there's a we? Why isn't there me and you? Why isn't there a Second Amendment that says I get to do what I want to do, as long as I don't break any other laws, and not have to answer to the will of the majority? And those of you interested in reading more about that, I give the Buchanan and Tulloch reference, but there's a paradox. How are we going to limit what the majority can do? We can't decide that by majority rule. We can't decide by majority rule what the limits on majority power are going to be. Because if the majority gets to decide what the majority gets to decide, there are no limits. But in a democracy, by definition, in a pure democracy, the majority gets to decide what the majority gets to decide. There's a problem of collective versus public choice. Collective choices are those that we decide together. Public choices are those where something I do affects you. The problem that we have in a democracy is that choices tend to be collectivized whether or not they are public. My individual choices, choices that I properly might make about my own person or about my own economic position, are collectivized in the sense that the power over those are taken by the we. There's a deep confusion. I'm not going to spend long on this little graph. It's kind of complicated. But there's a deep confusion between choosing as a collective and choices that actually present, in an economic sense, the problem of public goods or the problem of externalities. Those of you who had economics recognize probably that distinction. Democracy collectivizes everything. No private choices can stand in the face of a majority that gets to decide what the majority gets to decide. So we move from individual decisions towards collective decisions. The most important property line in the United States is not between what is mine and what is yours. The most important property line is that between what is mine and what is ours. That property line is undefended. That property line is undefined. That property line over time has been worn away. This is a question that anybody who works with groups of people has to confront. And most of you are going to work in groups of people unless you become a professor and live as a hermit. Can a group of people who disagree come to a consensus? It's possible that you can end a disagreement by coming to agree. But a lot of times you can't hope to do that. Do the choices then of majorities tell us anything about the right thing to do in the face of disagreement? Is there in fact such a thing as the majority, which we just have to process through voting or some political process? That is, does it exist and it's just a problem of discovery? The last line is an ontological problem. Who knows what ontology is and is willing to admit it? Because if you do, you probably have to stand alone at parties. I know, but I'm not telling. I know that all of you know, but I'm going to say anyway because it's not cool to admit. Ontology is being, the study of being, of existence. Is there such a thing as a we that wants things? I know what it means to say I want something. I know what it means to say you want something. But if we disagree, how can we say we want anything? We may have a decision rule. We may have a way that we choose. We may have a way that we decide that we all agree will be binding on us. But it's not clear that it makes sense to go from we're going to vote but we disagree to and therefore we want this. That therefore doesn't follow as a matter of ontology, as a matter of implication. Institutions, I studied with the economist Douglas North at Washington University, who later won a Nobel Prize, and his definition of institutions are the humanly devised rules of the game that shape and direct human interaction. The actual choice of institution is hard because there's countless ways of choosing, and in fact, if you look at the US Constitution, there's a very complex set of institutions in the Constitution for how we decide. How would we decide if some of those are better than others? Problem is that the way that we aggregate preferences may have more to do with the choice we make than the preferences themselves, which is disturbing, and we'll do an example soon. But if the way we choose tells us more about the outcome than the choices we make as individuals, that's way too much pressure on the rules. That's way too much dependence on the rules. And is democracy a good institution? How would we know? Is there such a thing then as public opinion in the sense that it speaks to us as an oracle, as a commander, as something that has moral force? This is what the public wants and therefore you should want it too.